I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the truth, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
I'm Matt Bernico. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
This week on the show, we're going to talk with Sargon Donabed, the author of a great book called Reforging, A Forgotten History, Iraq and the Assyrians in the 20th Century. Sargon's work focuses on the excluded histories of Assyrian people, and that might seem like kind of a strange thing to talk about on a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics, but we're going to try to contextualize why, in fact, it isn't, and why it's actually really important to talk about on this exact podcast, and to sort of bring into the orbit of people on the left. So initially, we got an email from a new friend of ours named Maya. She's an Assyrian who writes from a progressive perspective. She has a really great blog that we'll link in the show notes, but you can find it at ninwa, ninwa.home.blog. So she sent us a bunch of really great resources and a link to a blog that she wrote about the persecution of Assyrian Christians that's called WANA Christianity and Western Leftism. The acronym is West Asian North African Christianity. So she says in the blog, and we'll talk through it a little bit here just to kind of set up a very long interview with Sargon, but she says in that post that Assyrians have been ignored by the left and politicized by the right, and that creates a really big problem. And in light of Maya's email, we're going to try to work through the problem as she presents it on her blog just really briefly, and then go to Sargon for this deeper historical perspective. Before we do that, we want to encourage you at the top here to read her blog yourself. It's pretty short and straightforward. And the post is embedded in a lot of other neat things that she writes, so genuinely an interesting person to be following. And she also has a Patreon at patreon.com/ninwa. We'll link all that stuff in the show notes, so you can find it there as well. But let's dive right in here. Matt, what really stuck out to you about this post?
Yeah, there's so much. It's a huge perspective that, it's completely lost on me until she sent it to us. So, again, super grateful that she did. So the post starts off like this and kind of encapsulates the problem here this way. So she writes, West Asia and North Africa is ethnically and religiously diverse. However, the region is often discussed in a homogeneous manner. Many people believe that West Asia and North Africa is populated only by Arab Muslims, and is often referred to as the, quote, Arab world or Muslim world. These beliefs and narratives continue the erasure of other ethnic, religious, and indigenous groups in the region, and strips them of any agency. So she starts kind of setting up this problem for us, doing something that I love. I mean, I'm a person who has read a lot of sort of ethnic studies and decolonial theory. So this thing that she's kind of setting up here is super interesting to me. How have we, who are these people that we've forgotten? And then she goes on to explain, though, that the only notable and recent coverage of West Asia and North Africa Christians by progressive outlets, most notably Think Progress and Vox, there's some stuff from them, is the June detention of over 100 Iraqis, most of whom were Christian, by ICE in Michigan. As expected, this coverage is mostly distorted by a partisan narrative of, you see, the right wing doesn't care about you. So I guess what's so interesting to me about the way she's framing this problem and the way she's kind of explaining it is that being sort of in the bubble that is, my sort of Protestant corner of it, is that I hear people talk about Christians in Iraq kind of a lot. My church, they were supporting missionaries to Iraq for this period of time, trying to convert people. And like that was kind of the context in which I heard it, and I think that really turned me off to a lot of these ideas, or even like to kind of understand who these people in Iraq were, because it's like through this like very evangelical lens. But as Maya puts it, though, like there's a lot more going on here than I think that my church would let me know, or probably my church even does know, or even like the media narratives of the left or the right in the United States would let you know, that there are a diverse group of people in these regions, and they deserve our attention because of, because they deserve our attention because they're people, but also because they face persecution every day.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a lot of really interesting things, too, that Maya points out here and elsewhere about how I think leftists are sort of reticent to be interested in Assyrians, and especially to take the Assyrian people up as sort of a cause, or to try to understand them on their own terms. And Sargon talks about this too, but the reticence stems from a worry about being Islamophobic, or by pointing out the way in which people suffer in regions that are predominantly Muslim or have a large Muslim hegemony. I think the assumption of many people on the left is that, well, if you start kind of paying attention to Christians there and giving that a real sort of weight in your politics, you sort of inadvertently fuel these Islamophobic fears that are real in places like the U.S. and Canada, but are not necessarily stoked by people really understanding Assyrians on their own terms by any stretch, right? And it's a really, really powerful and important point, and May makes it really well. So I encourage everyone to read it a little longer, read the post in full, that is. But I want to read a little bit more about what she says here. The media and their audiences should care about us on our own terms, us being Assyrians, outside of Western left versus right paradigms. Pay attention to us as Assyrians and minority Christians rather than addressing us as partisan props to confirm convenient narratives. The void left by Western leftists is filled by right-wingers who acknowledge us for their reactionary agendas. Their interest in our cause is too often predicated solely on the fact that we are Christian and then used to justify racism and xenophobia. Because of the dire situation for West Asian North African minorities, a desperation caused by decades of dismissal, mere acknowledgement is enough to acquire Assyrian support, and more importantly, Assyrian votes for right-wing parties and politicians. In a Western socio-political context, this susceptibility to right-wing lip service is only solidified by the aforementioned commentary, or lack thereof, from liberals and leftists. And I think, again, that just sort of really drives home the point that not only are Assyrians a people who deserve to be understood on their own terms, but they are sort of driven into the seemingly open arms of the right, because the right is at least interested in them, even if it's in for their own purposes, or kind of cynically interested. And Maya is encouraging us to think that there's no reason that has to be the case, and it sort of stems from a lack of the left being willing to really engage the Syrian people on their own terms, and provide some points of contact and reach out and organize that community that deserves to sort of be heard and have a seat at the table of doing politics and making a better world.
Yeah, I'm really convicted, I think, by what Maya says, though, about the ways that I guess Christians in general, but like right-wing Christians specifically, have used the Assyrians, or just like Christians in the Middle East, for their own sort of political ends. I think about I don't know if y'all have ever seen it, but one of the common sort of symbols, or like one of the common symbols that you might see if you're in an extremely Christian world is like the Arabic letter for N, which is like sort of to denote solidarity with the persecuted Christians of the Middle East, or the West Asia area. But it's used for completely political ends, and not kind of understanding them as people, or understanding them, or only having an interest in them because they are Christians or something. And I think that should be very troubling to us.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's exactly right. So, Sargon is going to do a lot of work just in a minute here, kind of helping us to understand who the Assyrian people are, how they sort of get factored in or don't get factored in to both academic and popular understandings of what happens in the region of Iraq in particular, but also sort of more broadly, which I think is really, really genuinely useful. But I think that one just really important preface is to go back and read Maya's blog as a really important setup, especially for how leftists can hopefully be better at thinking this stuff through and kind of encourage us to do a lot more homework on our own. So encourage everybody to check that out as maybe like a preface or an epilogue, I guess, if you don't want to take a break from listening. And hope to see a lot more from May in the future.
So whenever we invite authors on the show, we ask them to do like a quick elevator pitch for their book or their essay. With some people, it's a very long elevator ride all the way to the very, very top floor. So could you just tell us a little bit about Reforging a Forgotten History and what it's about, and what did you hope to accomplish with it?
Sure, thank you. Thank you guys for having me on the show. I appreciate it, and I look forward to these questions, although I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. So, the book Reforging a Forgotten History, it's pretty funny because I'm starting to write elevator pitches for fantasy novels that I'm writing, and it's a whole different ballgame for an academic work. So essentially with Reforging a Forgotten History, my thought was to offer the reader an insight into a brief history of the Assyrian people, who very few people know about, and to show the essentialness of the Assyrian people to a wider audience in a larger world. So even beyond just simply knowing who and what they are, but also the essentialness of how they participate in the Middle East at large, but also in the world at large, and the commonalities they have with other communities, and have had throughout their history. So that's sort of the general idea. That would be the general elevator pitch that I would tell to people who knew very little about who and what the Assyrians were, but really trying to make visible a sort of unknown entity in this people in this community, and to offer it to an audience who just is quite unfamiliar with that. And I think people tend to view all this as slight portions of the Middle East and Middle Eastern history that they've heard about, or something from ancient history or from biblical history. And I think what I've tried to do is to take those maybe tidbits or sound bites that people have had over the years, and put it into a context so that people, the reader especially, or the readers, can take a step back and place the Assyrian situation, the Assyrian predicament in question, into the larger context of the historical record of the Middle East, and the world as a whole, especially in the 20th century. But also, I have to admit, there's a second part here, and I promise the elevator pitch was done like 10 minutes ago. This is just me talking. The other piece of it was to show that, and I argued this in the sense of what I couldn't think of a better name for it, but panenhistoricism, sort of I stole a religious studies concept of panentheism, and utilized it in the utilized it in the sense of seeing a larger, the story of history, or reality, the paradigm of existence, to be larger and too difficult for us to understand as a whole, but that every small piece that we learn about, that we are able to in a sense research and learn about, it allows us to have a more fully vivid view of the totality of history. And understanding we'll never have the full picture, but this Assyrian story, this particular narrative of Assyrians in Iraq, for instance, helps us to have yet a better piece, sort of fill in pieces of the puzzle. And so that was my idea, was to say, this is my contribution to the world, human history, but let's say more than human history, and moving in a particular direction to say, yes, other communities belong here, individual stories belong here, and the more pieces we have, the more bright, vivid our history is, the historical record is. So that was the other reason for doing it.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you were able to say something about your methodology too, because in addition to you, I think, accomplishing that goal of introducing the Assyrian people and that history to at least the two of us who had no idea really about how to think about that or what to think about it, the way that you try to parse all this stuff out is genuinely interesting on its own sort of merits, and you make some suggestions in the book that you could sort of do this for this sort of panenhistorical method for a number of other really complicated narratives and stories, and I hope that people do. It is really fascinating. Your introduction gives us a brief sort of understanding, that is, of the Assyrian people and especially their history in Iraq. Could you summarize a little bit of that for our listeners, many of whom, like we were just saying, have never heard of Assyrians, and then also maybe say a little bit about why it's important to think through that history and geography? You know, what's the reason for choosing this story to kind of make available to a broader audience?
Sure. Yeah, I absolutely can do that. So if we take a look at the Assyrian people, first and foremost, the Assyrians are a people that are native to what is essentially northern Mesopotamia and its environs. So if you think about what is today's northern Iraq, the northeast of Syria, the northwest of Iran, and the southeast of Turkey, that's essentially where the Assyrian people have found themselves off and on for the greater part of really 5,000-6,000 years. So it's a long history of a people, of a community that and they've certainly moved around. I mean, people assume that people stay in one spot for forever, and many people do. They don't necessarily go too far, but even within that territory, there was always frequent migrations back and forth. So the Assyrians are, I always try to explain it as they are definitely an indigenous people. There is no country today, no legal national, entity that is the state of Assyria. Of course, the state of Syria and the name of the state of Syria is obviously borrowed from the ancient Assyrian Empire, so it's used today. But it's confusing because people assume that there's a connection, and the vast majority of people living in the state of Syria today would not espouse Assyrian cultural heritage at all. And although there are many Assyrians who do live in Syria, although of course that's becoming a smaller and smaller number as the years pass. So Assyrians are an indigenous people, native people to Mesopotamia, to the Middle East. Arguably have the longest continuous living culture of most of the groups, but perhaps the oldest one. I mean, continuous culture, and by that I mean language, folklore, art, all those traditions sort of wrapped together into culture, and they are today, I mean, a truly transnational people because they're divided within these different countries, but they're also divided, further out than the four countries that I mentioned. There are Assyrians in Jordan and Lebanon who left as refugees from other places, ended up in these countries. Some have been there for a generation or two. There are Assyrians pretty much anywhere in the globe you wish to visit. There are probably some Assyrians somewhere around there in one of the towns or villages, pretty much anywhere you can think of. So today, it's a largely diaspora people. The Assyrians live predominantly outside of what their home territory or territories have been historically. They speak a language that is in the two major dialects. The two major dialects of Assyrian. One is usually termed Surith. For the people themselves, the reference in their own language would be Surith. In the Eastern dialect and the Western dialect, they use the term Sureit. It's actually the exact same word, it's just slightly different pronunciation. And there are distinctions in the two dialects, but the language is essentially the same. It has roots that go all the way back to grammatically. It's very much what's considered an Aramaic language in its roots, again, grammatically speaking, but it has a heavy Akkadian influence as well. And and a cultural Mesopotamian influence on the Aramaic language. So, it's not. People tend to think it's the Galilean Aramaic or something of the first century, and it's really not. It's a Mesopotamian language, and it is. And the reason that Assyrians call it Assyrian today is because it is an Assyrian language. In essence, it's the language of the culture of the people in that region. So it's heavily influenced by that, by the actual context of where it was used, in the sense of American English. If that makes sense. American English, Australian English, the English in the UK. I mean, all of these are slightly different. Scots English is distinct in that sense as well. So, it has a very native quality to it, rather than, as Aramaic was the lingua franca of the entire territory at one point until the advent of Arabic. So in the Near East, you had Aramaic spread throughout in different communities and different people speaking it. So, the Assyrians also are predominantly Christian, historically. And I'm probably going to get myself into some trouble saying this because I'm sure some of the people who see the Christian part of their heritage to be the most, I don't know really how to put this, but probably the most prominent part of their heritage, maybe. They may not necessarily see this as, in their mind, as particularly true, but there are many Assyrians who, in the same sense of Armenians, there's a term that's used, especially post Ottoman Empire, the genocide against the various groups in the, particularly the Armenians, the Assyrians, and the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire. The term that's sometimes used is crypto-Armenians, at least in the Armenian case, and it's started to be used recently among the Assyrians as well. So these crypto-Assyrians, people who lived in particular regions, and over time some of them were probably originally Christian, many of them were converted, and retained some sense of who and what they were, both their cultural heritage and their identity, but also maybe a little bit of their language, maybe a little bit of their original religious identity too. But for all intents and purposes, they are practicing Muslims, and in certain places in Turkey, many people have come out and said, I am, or my ancestors are or were Assyrians. So that's been a more recent turn, but it's an interesting one because it further, in a sense, complicates things, but it complicates things in a good way because it shows that Assyrian is not a sectarian and has never been a sectarian identity. People would assume that it's a church or it's a religious community, and it can be. I mean, these are all different pieces of identity, but it's much broader than that. It has a real umbrella existence to it, and many things are sort of captured within it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. That historical aspect and sort of like the complication of the geography and the sort of language all helps us kind of get like a better understanding who the Assyrians are, and I guess like what they why it's important to know who they are. But before we get into more about like who what does that history mean for us today, I want to ask you a question about one more sort of theoretical distinction that you make in your book that I think is really cool. So also in your introduction, you make a really helpful distinction that emphasizes the importance of another scholar who I think a lot of other folks in cultural studies, religious studies read a lot, Edward Sayid. So you're specifically offering like kind of an intervention on some of Sayid's work, especially Orientalism. So I'm just going to read this quote and then you can comment on it, I suppose. So you say, unsurprisingly, Edward Sayid's Orientalism creates a powerful dualistic worldview and explicates a variety of issues from a constructivist viewpoint. But here the Assyrians still do not figure. They are neither Arab nor principally Muslim, yet Sayid's framework for the attitude of how people define themselves and others is pertinent. In essence, Assyrians function as the third world of the third world, and Assyrian issues are thus no longer real history, and have been relegated to a fourth world identity issue. While misunderstandings of the West have led to Assyrian overshadowing in recent years, misunderstandings of the East have done likewise for a lengthier period. In other words, the Orient too otherizes the Assyrians. So, given your additional explanation, how can including Assyrian people into our understanding of, like a panenhistorical view or, just real history help us rethink the hierarchy of like knowledge production?
I haven't read that quote since I wrote it, I think. So it's been a while. Thank you for reminding me of it. So
it's a good quote.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Sometimes you surprise yourself with what you're able to accomplish when you're writing. You're sort of in the midst of in this creative process. I do definitely still think that this is valid. I mean, I don't think anything has changed. Essentially, I mean, if it makes sense for people, for the readers, and for the listeners of the podcast to understand, let me say that to simplify this, what I meant was that, and I'll also refer to a short article in Perspectives, the AHA newsletter that myself and Daniel Tower and myself wrote a couple of years ago, well, no, about a year ago maybe, on indigeneity, the issue of indigeneity in Assyrians. So essentially, I think what happens is that in most cases, and this is something I deal with as a professor here in the United States, in the quote-unquote West, if we're going to use some of these sort of monoliths, is that in most cases, the viewpoint, so the perspective, the lens that is used to look at different peoples and communities tends to be the biggest problem in understanding these communities in a quote unquote authentic fashion, if we want to use that term. So what I mean by that is, when we look at the Middle East, people will say, oh, well, we need to look at it from a different lens. Or if we look at Middle Easterners or Middle Eastern communities, people say, let's look at it not from a Western lens or a Western gaze, but perhaps from a different lens. So how does one do that? Well, we need to look at it from, utilize an Eastern gaze or some other type of viewpoint. But what happens with that is that, again, these are sort of monolithic understandings. And so when we have a monolithic understanding, we have so many issues that actually cause more problems, I think, than we originally had. So what Sayid did was try to express, in my understanding, that basically we've created a dichotomy between the East and the West, and there is a dichotomy to an extent, because of how we've created it. And people understand this dichotomy, this sort of polarization, by utilizing their lens. The East is orientalized from a Western gaze, right? And that's everything from thinking about how people used to view I always use the sort of the over-sexualization, the fetishization of the Ottoman harems. Does that make sense? Like that sort of, mm-hmm. This sort of romantic view of, and also, a little bit like the noble savage, sort of the sense that, or the view of native peoples of the United States, American Indian nations, the sort of that noble savage idea that existed. So it's obviously problematic, and so people then started saying, well, we need to look at these Middle Eastern communities from, let's say, an Eastern gaze. So people started looking at it and saying, oh, we're not remembering to talk about X, Y, and Z, and started discussing these other communities. The problem is that groups like the Assyrians, so when the West views the East, the West will sometimes see the East and stereotype the East, especially the Middle East, the Near East, however you want to term it. And frequently people will say, oh, this is what it is. The East is Arab and it's Muslim, right? We always hear that. This is the Arab, quote unquote, Arab world that people talk about. So what does that do? Well, that then creates a mindset where people see the Middle East as Arab Muslim, from a Western perspective. Now, there are all sorts of things that come along with that. And of course, people will look at it very negatively because they view the term Muslim negatively. And that's a whole issue in and of itself. And that's a lot of what Sayid is discussing. The problem is that what that does is it sort of, the view itself neglects to see that there's a sort of a multifaceted Middle East that people don't want to look at. In the same way that there's a multifaceted West, right? I mean, the West it's not the United States, right? It's not just McDonald's. It's not just Starbucks. There's a lot more that goes into, people will say, I remember during the age of George W. Bush, where traveling to certain areas, people would say, "Oh, is George Bush? You voted for George Bush." There was this whole discussion of politics in the United States, and we don't like George Bush in different places. There was always this discussion, and very frequently, people living in the United States would say, "Well, if someone didn't agree with him, would say, well, I didn't vote for him, and no, I don't necessarily agree with him. Just because that particular person is president." And espouses certain ideas and certain views of even Christianity, for instance, that doesn't mean everyone in the United States is a reflection of that particular person. But some of them are. I mean, and it is a reflection of some people. So there is that issue. The problem is, as I stated with the Assyrians don't even figure in. So when the West is viewing the East, it's viewing this Arab Muslim world. And so either it is demonizing them, or it's romanticizing them. Maybe to some extent it has some objective, slightly quote unquote objective view, but the reality is that all views are pretty much subjective. So we tend to go on one extreme or the other. Now the Assyrians don't figure in. So people will then say, well, what's the other way of looking at it? Well, then look at it from an Eastern gaze. So the Eastern gaze will then look at the Assyrians, or look at itself, and from within the East, you would assume that, within the East, people would say, oh, well, we are also a multifaceted, multicultural society with various ethnic and religious groups. And that is the case of the Middle East. But the reality is that the view of the Middle East on itself, or of itself, I should say, is very, very narrow. And because of that, the Assyrians don't figure in there either. And the Assyrians don't exist in any country in the Middle East as a distinct ethnic cultural group. I mean, they don't exist anywhere. There's not one. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, they're not actually. I mean, there's places where they exist as a religious sect. They're mentioned as a religious group, as a religious sect, but not as a distinct, ethnic or ethnocultural or ethno-religious, however you want to term it, community or people. And that's pretty telltale. I mean, in the United States, we talk about census and all the different ways in which you can identify on a census. In most countries, the Assyrians haven't been able to even do that. So this is kind of the problem or this has been the problem with Sayid, and the way in which, I talk to my friends. I say, when my colleagues will say, oh, please, and I have a lot of global South scholars as friends who will say, oh, please do something on the Middle East. We'd love to hear more about the Middle East. Oh, could you do something on, for instance, Muslim women in America? And so, of course, that's not my focus area at all. And it's a whole different area of scholarship, which there are plenty of people that are more versed in that could deal with that. But I try to express it by saying, no, what I do is kind of like imagine you guys doing, talking about communities or working on communities and discussing those communities in the United States, for instance, and talking about the history of the United States from a white European perspective. You wouldn't do that, right? You would talk about, especially nowadays, people start to think more about, oh, well, there's a large portion of Black America that was part and parcel of this, what became the United States, and the whole issue of slavery. I mean, that entire period of time that tends to be neglected, only talked about, in terms of slavery and the problems with slavery. But this is an entire culture of people, or various cultures of people that came here that are very different from that European, the sort of the Western European standpoint. And then you have, of course, even older than that, you have native communities, you have indigenous communities and nations. I mean, many, many nations that have lived here. Would you talk about the history of the United States without including them? Of course not. No global South scholar, no, let's say left scholar or left espousing scholar would ever say that. So what's interesting is, well, then why would you assume the Middle East to be white European? It's almost like it's that same issue. And so what my worry was that this is kind of the same way it's viewed. Once we say, oh, let's be inclusive of the Middle East, the inclusivity of of quote unquote the Middle East is still a very narrow view of the Middle East. It's still a very, it's using the Western gaze for the Middle East and to say, oh yes, we understand you are neglected. We want to bring you into our discussion. We want to talk about you. We want to express your issues to the world. But the tertiary community, right? The secondary and the tertiary communities in the Middle East, those indigenous peoples, still are not talked about, neither by the Western scholars, even by Global South scholars to an extent, and not by the Easterners themselves. I mean, very infrequently do Assyrians fit into the history of the Middle East. I'll give the example of the Ba'ath Party that's in my book. During the Ba'ath expansion, the growth of Ba'athism in Syria and Iraq, the history texts that were written, even prior to the Ba'ath Party, I should say, going back even further, the history texts that were written and that then were implemented in the school system, I mean, talked about all the major peoples of the Middle East as basically coming out of the Arabian Peninsula. So what that did was sort of equate everyone with being essentially connected to the Arab ethnicity, to being ethnically Arab, which was obviously hugely problematic for a great many people, and not to mention incorrect. But this type of issue is just, I mean, you see it throughout the Middle East. We see it in education systems. It was in Iraq. It was in Syria. I don't know. I have to say I know things have changed in the Kurdish region of Iraq recently, where the texts are being rewritten. But in the Kurdish region, for instance, there are texts that are being rewritten that show, and now these are texts that Assyrian children are also reading, that show particular people in the Kurdish region who, historically speaking, committed crimes against the Assyrian community as heroes, right? In the same way that when you're, nation building, you create the sort of myth of the nation. That's also happening right now in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And so now young Assyrian children are reading these texts, and they're being exposed to seeing certain people who, from the Assyrian standpoint, were involved in mass killings, or in one case, one of them was involved in enslaving many women and children. Now see that as, or at least they're being portrayed as heroes in the educational system, and of course that then influences children as they grow up and they begin to think things differently. So, we haven't seen where that's going to go for the future, but all of this is created by these worldviews. I mean, all of it is created by how, Sayidist mentality or this dichotomizing things. And I'm not saying it's just he did it. He was noticing that other people had been doing it, but it is problematic. And that's why I did not want to go down that same path with my historical view.
Yeah, well, all that is a really helpful way, even so far, of just kind of setting up like the general kind of problems around even the way in which Assyrian peoples can be understood or sort of visible to the sort of global stage more broadly, not just academically, but even popularly. And I mean, we're curious about that, as both Matt and I are from the United States. I live in Tirana now, but like we grew up during the Iraq War, and not the kind of story that you usually hear on like Fox News or CNN is about like what's going on with the Assyrians in that region that we're like actively in conflict with. I guess, I want to combine a couple of questions here because I think they sort of go together. First of all, you've talked sort of academically about how Assyrians don't show up because of certain biases or prejudices, and maybe those are the same in popular culture, but maybe not. So perhaps you could say something about that. Why do Assyrians and other people in West Asian or Middle Eastern, however you want to put it, that sort of region, why are they usually outside the scope of kind of media narratives about what's going on there? And then maybe sort of secondly, just talking about a specific sort of media narrative that happens in the U.S., especially when we do hear something about Christians in Iraq, it's usually in the context of them being persecuted by Islamists or, whatever. They're the victims of terrorism. And these stories then get sort of transformed into these broader media stories that fuel public support for intervention or Islamophobia even in the U.S., and that kind of totally erases the whole complexity of what you're getting at here. So as someone with this really intimate knowledge of the region, what's a better way that we in the U.S. or Canada or elsewhere can kind of think through these kinds of one-dimensional media narratives? So first of all, the narrative in which Assyrians don't even show up, and then secondly, the one in which Assyrians become a sort of a piece on like a board game of trying to sort out, manufacturing consent for imperialism or something like that.
Great question. Media plays obviously a huge role. I mean, so much of who and what we are today is based on, or how we view ourselves and how young children react to things. I mean, everything's social media based right now, of course. So that is, it can be a huge boon to a community. But it can also be hugely detrimental, as we know. So, and also, part of the problem is the assumption that social media or media and the attention of media is a correct reflection of society. So there's a lot of stuff that I guess can be dealt with in this particular question. First, the first question that you guys had about the lack of if I'm correct, the lack of Assyrian, or the lack of attention on Assyrians in general. That was the first one, correct? So if I think about that, I mean, I think I wouldn't even be able to answer that without adding that second part, which is, then why is the focus, or when there is focus, it seems to be on the persecution element. I think it's all wrapped together. In essence, the Assyrians serve, and because of their, minoritized, or let's say, in this sense, actually marginalized status in so many different facets, or different facets of being, let's say, marginalized, the Assyrians can really just serve as a means to an end, in the sense that if the story or the narrative of what's happening to Assyrians can drum up support, popular support for intervention in a particular country or nation state halfway across the globe that people know very little about, but it can be appealed to by stating that this is an ancient Christian sect with ties to the language of Jesus, and creating this sort of again, this hugely romantic view of who and what the Assyrians are. And I'm probably not going to be the most popular person among many Assyrians by saying what I am, because many Assyrians count on that to drum up the attention so that there is a focus on Assyrians. And it's funny. I mean, I do argue this in the text. I've argued it many times at conferences, and that is that from a left perspective, I mean, the left does not generally talk about the Assyrians because from a leftist perspective, again, there's more this issue of, we don't want to demonize peoples, which is a good thing. And so it's about talking, at least in the case of the Middle East, talking about the problem of Islamophobia and trying to get people to understand that, we're part of a larger world. And these are problematic ways in which we view each other, and we don't want Islamophobia here and things like that. So because of that, the Assyrian narrative doesn't really, at least even the narrative of hey, these are persecuted people, doesn't really fit into the leftist media push. It only fits into the right media push because of the Christian element, right? To appeal to sort of that baseline of, like, let's say the American, sometimes people talk about it to the, and I don't want to conflate these two or confuse these two, fundamentalist Christians and evangelical Christians, because I know they are not necessarily the same, and that's a problem in and of itself. But to connect to those larger groups, to say, hey, these are fellow Christians being persecuted. We need to focus on them. We need to help them. And so therefore, we're going to have some kind of an intervention. I mean, of course, they don't use that as the whole reason for the intervention, but it's a nice little piece to add on to it. That piece of compassion, or that touches, people's empathy, gets people to sympathize and empathize with this community. But the reality is both of them are problematic, of course, right? So it's tied together in the sense that from one side they're not being mentioned because it doesn't fit into the narrative. From the other side, they're being mentioned because it does fit into the narrative, but it only fits into the narrative so far, and it only appeals to a certain type of person. And so for many Assyrians over the years, especially in the United States and in Canada, I would see sort of especially the older generation would have a more, let's say, a conservative lean, because they would think that, at the very least, the right of center media, or the centrist and right of center media, are at least talking about who and what we are and what's happening to our people, whereas sometimes from the leftist perspective, that's not even happening. So people were getting a little frustrated with that, especially an older generation who's seen probably far more persecution than those of us who've been one or two generations living in, let's say, the United States or in Canada or in other, let's say, in a Western European country like the UK or something like that. So there is this issue that's going to keep coming up, and of course it also creates problems for the Assyrian identity, because that then furthers this sort of all or nothing Assyrian Christian Assyrian, right? You have to attach those two terms together. You have to be an Assyrian. You have to be to be an Assyrian. You have to be Christian, and sort of in a not vice versa, but these two pieces are absolutely tied together. And so then that leaves out, well, what about these other folks, as I had mentioned earlier, who are Muslim today, whether or not they were converted 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago? Are they no longer Assyrian? Are they not allowed to be Assyrian? How does that fit into it? Mm-hmm. So those are real problems that the Assyrian community will have to deal with in the near future. The problem is, though, the assumption, and I'll attach this to that question. It leads to another issue, which is the assumption of people that they should somehow, they being the Assyrian community people, the Assyrian people, should somehow be able to create a bulwark against this negativity, and be able to work against it. The problem is that for most Assyrians, they're still living in survival mode. So in order to get to this sort of nuanced view of the world where everybody belongs, and I mean, I'm an animal rights activist. I'm finishing a master's of science degree in anthrozoology precisely because I love and view the world as a larger than human world. And because of that, I'm deeply interested and invested in that viewpoint and that sort of radical, although it's really not radical to me, but radical for perhaps many people, paradigm shift in our minds, in our culture, to look at this world as larger than just a human-based world with human concerns. Right? The anthropocentrism that's really sort of infected, I think, and caused a lot of problems in our world today. The current environmental crisis, biodiversity crisis being chief among them. But for me to say that, to be sitting here and saying that, I think is kind of a luxury. And for a lot of Assyrians, they don't have that. If you're living in survival mode, attempting to just find a place to eat and to survive in a system, in a rentier state, in an authoritarian regime. I mean, these things are sort of secondary to just being able to put food on the table for your family. And so I remember during my defense, one of my reviewers had said, that was a spirited defense. And of course, if Sargon, being an Assyrian, isn't going to talk about Assyrians, then who is? And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of unfair. I mean, you're assuming that the elitist world of academia, I mean, or the Assyrians should be participating wholly in this elitist world where, most Assyrians, as I said, are just trying to get by. They haven't come out of survival mode fully yet. And so to assume that, this world that was basically created by people and families of people who didn't know what to do with their kids at some point, except send them on for further schooling, because they had the money to do so and they didn't have to do anything else. Again, many of us were lucky. We came into it in a different way. Many of us, those of us that are doing it, like us, are trying to make a difference and change things. But again, it was a luxury for us to get where we are in some way. I'm not saying we didn't have to fight for it or didn't have to work hard for it. But to assume that, somebody who just lived through the destruction that was wrought by ISIS is somehow just going to say, well, Assyrians don't really have a place in academia. If I don't do it, no one's going to do it, so I'm going to go do it. I'm going to go write the history of Assyrians. It's probably not going to happen. And by the same token, you don't have Assyrians in media, right, to tell their own stories. You just don't have them in these places that would make it easier for them to have a more balanced discussion of who and what they are, and also to be able to offer this to a larger audience. So really, again, to go back to your original questions, the two of them, they're tied together, and because Assyrians don't really have much say in it, they themselves are put into these two categories by the media and by what the media, or how the media wants to view them. So that it's a problem. It's a problem, and it probably will continue to be an issue for quite some time until Assyrians, are able to insert themselves a little bit better, stronger into these different avenues and forms of expression. So, and again, it's so much of it is dependent on the issue of moving past just basic survival. And I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon in my lifetime or the lifetime of my children. Who knows?
Yeah, that's a really helpful explanation. It's such an interesting thing because the history of the left in the United States, at least, is one that like journalism has been kind of important in a lot of different ways for kind of lifting up stories that other people might not have heard, and making things known and kind of like shedding light to where persecution and oppression happens. Mm-hmm. But I think it's, based on what you said, and I think based on the blog that we talked about at the beginning of the show, it's clear that like that has not happened, that there's sort of like a vacuum when it comes to Assyrians and like media coverage, or even like people just knowing about them. Our friend Maya, whose blog we talked about earlier, she says that the way media outlets talk about or don't talk about Assyrians makes it easier for Assyrians to identify with right-wing movements, based on the fact that conservative outlets are usually the ones focusing on Christian oppression. So if that's the case, do you think that there's been a failure on the part of the left to engage and address this like sort of global persecution of Assyrians? And also, what can people who are on the left, but maybe just not only people who are on the left, do to show types of solidarity with Assyrians? How can we improve ourselves?
Interestingly, the way I think about it sometimes is, and the way we think about it is still dichotomized, right? This sort of left and right way of viewing the world. But it's interesting. I mean, let's go with it now, just because we've already kind of boxed ourselves into these ideas and these identities of being left and right. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this is part of the problem. Dean and Matt, when you guys asked me to do this, I thought to myself, how am I going to come across to everybody who's going to listen to this and think, well, does he sound like he's on the left? Does he sound like he's on the right? Where do we position this guy? And I can tell you, without a doubt in my mind, I don't think I fall into any category, or at least I don't want to, because I find so many problems with all these ways that we've sort of categorized ourselves. And I think that the present situation in the United States can attest to that, the political situation at the very least, but also the social situation. I did my graduate studies in Toronto as well, so I know the area well. I spent 6-7 years in Canada and then moved back to the States. So I've had that experience of being somewhere else with not a strict necessarily left and right view, where you had various parties that could speak to the situation of the country, which I liked. I have to say, I really liked being able to look at it from more than just two perspectives. But it is a problem here in this country, because when you are categorized as being on one side or the other, it then becomes sort of that pet project of that group. So I agree absolutely with Maya's understanding that at least in the case of the Assyrians, because the Assyrian, I mean, it's really the Christian thing. So it's really not the Assyrian thing, because at the end of the day, I mean, how can I say this more blatantly? Fairly fundamentalist Christians who read Old Testament scripture are probably not going to like the Assyrians from that perspective. If they're going to read the historical texts and look at the situation of the Assyrians being sort of the strongest culture in the region, the at least political culture at the time, and in many cases having conflicts with the kingdom of Judea and Israel. I don't think most, and in fact, I know most right-leaning Christians, especially on the fundamentalist side, definitely don't like the Assyrians and see them as a bad or evil group of people. Or they villainize them. And that in and of itself is a huge problem. If anyone wants to read more about how the Assyrians are treated negatively there, I suggest Michael Mann's work on the dark side of democracy. Really great, 2 or 3 great quotes in there about how the Assyrians are sort of demonized, villainized from the perspective of people reading into reading too much into the old Jewish scriptures in the Old Testament, essentially the histories. So it's an interesting piece. I definitely suggest people look at it. But when it becomes the pet project again of the right, when the Christian thing, quote unquote, is a project of the right in the United States, and the Assyrians are being persecuted because of their Christianity, which is not the only reason that they've been persecuted or have or are currently persecuted, but that is a reason. And because of that seems to be the pet project of the right, and the left does not like that. In fact, I've again met with scholars who've said to me, well, the issue of minorities in the Middle East, or just sort of on a broader scale, the issue of minorities in the Middle East is an issue of Western intervention and Western imperialism, and the West has always been supportive of minorities. And I still remember confronting a scholar, a fairly well-known, well-renowned scholar, and I said, is that really the case? Do you really feel that? And he said, absolutely, yes, I do believe that. I think that is the case. And I said, I don't really think that that's the case. So, well, give me an example. And I said, well, the Assyrians haven't done too well with Western interventions. In fact, I would say none of the minoritized peoples or the marginalized peoples in the Middle East, the quote-unquote minorities, if you want to talk about them as such, have done well. Like, can you give me an example? And I remember the scholar thinking and not coming up with an example. I said, you can't give me an example. They're not doing well. Certainly not in the Middle East, and arguably not outside the Middle East, although probably better outside than in. And I realized, and he was interestingly a very strong leftist scholar who was all about the boycott and divestment of the state of Israel, and certainly understood and was interested in working on Palestinian rights, and I thought that's fascinating. So he doesn't seem to think that. In the case of that group, it seems like it works okay, but in the case of the other groups, it doesn't seem like it works as well. And so, why would he be supportive of the Palestinian movement, but not of let's say, the Assyrians or Armenians or Yazidis or some groups like that? And I do think, at the very least, with the quote unquote groups that are seen as first and foremost Christian, like the Assyrians, Armenians are slightly different only because they have a nation state, and so the way the media portrays them is a little bit different. But it's similar. But the Assyrians are seen first and foremost as a Christian group, and so because of that, they're just not figured into the leftist discourse. And I don't know if there's a way to fix that, except for Assyrians to do more of these types of podcasts and to talk about the fact that these aren't left and right issues. These are issues of humanity. These are issues of shared human culture. They're issues of compassion and ethics and ethical treatment of people that need to be discussed. The same way that I think I don't have any idea why issues of animal rights and animal protection and wildlife preservation and conservation are issues of the left. That to me makes absolutely no sense. They're not left issues. They're issues that should be the concern of everyone and everything. I have a very difficult time seeing these as issues that need to be dichotomized for one reason or another. And so I always try to remind people, these don't have to become, they're always political, but they don't have to be politicized for a particular side. They don't need to be They don't need to do that, and they don't need to become that. But I do think that the way in which Assyrians can talk more about that in the future, and also engage the, let's say, again, to go back to the quote unquote left, the media of the left, is to show even the Assyrians themselves to work more on solidarity movements. I would definitely suggest that the Assyrians themselves, from an academic perspective, but also from a social movement, social justice perspective, to do more work with other groups that have dealt with major pieces of persecution. And I would say that, they should work with especially indigenous groups. I'm a big proponent. I've always been a proponent of them working with indigenous groups and native groups, both in the US and Canada and elsewhere. And I actually know a few scholars in particular who are working with them. I know people that worked on, that were part of the Stand with Standing Rock movement, trying to show solidarity with those groups. And I think if they can reach out and do that, I mean, the sort of the Palestinian movement has been very successful in showing that solidarity, especially with, and I would say with African American movement, with African American solidarity too. So you do see a lot of connection with Palestinians and African Americans. So that definitely is an example of things that Assyrians can do. But by the same token, the persecuted communities, Jewish communities, Palestinian communities. I grew up in an area that was predominantly Irish Catholic, and we talk frequently about the persecution of the Irish and the treatment of the Irish over the years by the English, but also just in general in Europe, the trials and tribulations of the Irish and of other Celtic peoples. I mean, that's always been something that I've understood a little bit more than some of the other connections, because I grew up with predominantly people of Irish descent. So that has a place in my heart and in my understanding. And there's a lot that can be done there to show solidarity, to show connections with the people. And so the Assyrians have to take a bit of that work on themselves. I don't know that it's going to be easy or that they can do it immediately, but they definitely need to work on it. And it would be great for those groups also to try to reach out to kind of look beyond the sort of the stigma of Assyrians as, or at least part of the stigma as, some of the vocal groups being attached to right-wing media, and really see this as a human issue. This is an issue that goes beyond left and right, and these people can form solidarity movements with others. And sometimes it might just be in another group or community coming to the Assyrians and trying to make a connection. Because again, as I said, remember, in so many ways they're still dealing with issues of survival. So sometimes some movement from the outside is also helpful.
Yeah, that's really helpful, both on both scores. Just kind of talking about the role Assyrians might have, but also, especially for us, more importantly, the role that us non-Assyrians have. I have to admit, when Maya has been extremely gracious with us, trying to help us put all this together, and she had asked me, what are the sort of leftist movements that you're a part of do with respect to Assyrians? Because I do live in Toronto, which is it prides itself on being the most multicultural city in the world. And I had to admit, shamefully, that I don't really know. It's not to say that some of the people I'm involved with aren't doing that, but if they are, I have no idea, which is kind of a telling factor in itself.
Well, you also have the issue of probably doing your work as well. I mean, doing your scholastic work, your scholarly stuff, and that's probably not, sometimes certain things take precedent, and I totally understand that. And I think that's something people need to understand too. Just like for the Assyrians, certain portions of their life have taken precedent over, getting their story out to the media sometimes. I mean, sometimes it's easier to bury the stories than to deal with the pain of thinking about them, or at least that's what many people say to themselves. Of course, with modern studies of telling your stories and catharsis and stuff like that, we're starting to change that a little bit. But still, I mean, these things they're there, and they've been there for a reason. It's allowed people to cope with their situation and sort of continue.
Yeah, well, that's true. That is true, and I appreciate that you're throwing me a bone there, for sure. Though I will say that doesn't really seem to hold me back. But so I do want to say, though, because we are a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics, one thing that kind of jumped out reading your book was the connections that you drew between Assyrians and the Iraqi Communist Party. And you talk a little bit about how Assyrians, including the former secretary of the party, Yusuf Salman Yusuf, related to the Iraqi Communist Party. What connections are there between Assyrians and communists in the history of Iraq? And do you think there's any interesting lessons there maybe for Christians and the left today? I mean, I totally understand, and I think you're right to point out that this is an issue that transcends left-right dichotomies. I mean, these are just human beings who need to be understood on their own terms. But nevertheless, just in terms of our own specificity, what do you see kind of emerging there as something that's really intriguing or useful, or something that would be genuinely important for us on the left to kind of go back and maybe mine for some more tools or something like that?
Sure. Yeah. The issue of egalitarianism is of course the big issue, right? And so first and foremost, again, let me clarify that the Communist Party for any listener, when they talk about the Communist Party in Iraq, and I'm not an expert on the Communist Party of Iraq, so let me say that as well. But the Communist Party and the communist parties of the Middle East, they in a sense were vastly distinct from what you would think of as communism as it was in under the Soviets or under Stalinist control, and that's again, as we know, I mean, I don't want to split hairs, but the reality is communism as a concept versus Stalinism as it was practiced, or Chinese communism today, and in the sense of an oligarchical structure. I mean, these are the problems with when people say, oh, I'm going to throw this out and say Bernie's a socialist. Socialism is like communism, or nationalist socialist. That sounds like Nazism. And people just go through these buzzwords, and then they elicit some idea, and some people go crazy about these issues. And the reality is that the Iraqi Communist Party was a party that, at least when it was started, from its very inception, and probably, at least to the best of my knowledge and from my research, the first person that really spent time bringing these ideas to Iraq was a man by the name of Petros Vasily, or Pyotr Vasily, I guess was his sort of Slavic or Slav-sized name, I suppose. So this man was a man that was raised really in what's today the country of Georgia, and had been influenced by, what we would consider a sense of sort of socialist ideals or communist ideals in that sense of. But again, the sense of communism as connected to egalitarianism, where people were equal in front of the law, regardless of what your religion was, regardless of your primary language of use, regardless of your place of birth, or your station in society. So that sense of egalitarianism, I think, is the most important thing to understand here. And so when this also, of course, was deeply Marxist too, because it dealt with also modes of production and the economy. So otherwise, I guess it would sort of fall short of that full communist definition in the sense of Marxist communism. But the reality is that these guys, Vasily and then the ones who followed after him, I think they saw a real opportunity that could bridge all these different communities and all these different ethnic communities, religious communities, cultural communities, linguistic communities, and have a place for just about everybody. By the same token, I mean, people argued the same issue with Baathism. I mean, it's not strange that Michel Aflaq was a Christian who was one of the creators of Baathism. People saw this idea of Arabism, right, to sort of connect everyone who spoke the Arabic language and create a sort of common culture and ethnicity and ideal based on that, as a way to transcend the religious thing. The religious thing, and I'm using thing in quotes here, because Christians saw there, and certainly Jews as well, but also non-Christian, non-Jews, or let's say all non-Muslims would see their place in society as only going so far in most Muslim contexts. And so because of that, I think many found, Baathism as a sort of a good compromise where, it was about being an Arab rather than about, your religious identity. At least that's how it was, offered to them. And so that was exciting. That was something that a lot of people sort of could feed into, and they found it palpable. But I think, communism was the same, or it worked in a similar fashion, let's say. And so it allowed for an outlet for these people who could not find purchase in the everyday, basically cultural milieu, but really the sort of monoculture that started to develop in most Middle Eastern countries, especially in Iraq. It gave them an outlet for that. And so it's not strange that at times you had a large percentage, especially if you think about ratios, of that party being Assyrian, being members of the Assyrian community. So, and then, what does that have to do with today, or what can we read into it for today? I think what you see is that the sort of the great possibility of that is that, yeah, there is definitely a way in which a lot of different groups and peoples can work together. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in under a particular ethnic nomenclature or cultural understanding, but there's ways in which there can be a sense of egalitarianism in politics, in the state, that allow people to do and to be who and what they are. The part of the problem is that I don't know if we can get by the villainizing and the demonizing that has gone on with those terms today. So, again, the sort of AOC, Bernie Sanders, socialist stuff as being connected to communism and the negativity that's associated with all of that from a capitalist perspective. How do you discuss that without getting another group of people frustrated with you or feeling a sense of anger towards you or dismissing you altogether as just simply a socialist and a communist? So, this is sort of the tough part about that. And that's why I tried to, when I explained the Assyrian involvement in the Iraqi Communist Party, it was an outlet. It was an outlet of egalitarianism for them. And I think until they started creating their own groups, and they did have their own groups as well, the allowance of the Communist Party in Iraq to have that multicultural connection was allowed for the Assyrians to be connected and to be sort of plugged into a larger than Assyrian network, which allowed them to influence things a little bit more. So it was definitely helpful, and there are many people that espouse those beliefs. But again, vastly different than what you would think of certainly Stalinism or communism in other aspects today. But again, sense of egalitarianism where people could come together, people would be treated equally, people would be treated with respect, and that's really where I know it sounds like I'm romanticizing it, but that's really why these people got involved in it in the first place, and that's why it was brought there, by Vasily and others. And it's not so strange that most of its early leaders and a lot of its members, and proportionally and in the sense of ratio, the Assyrians had a large role there.
Cool, thanks. That's a really helpful way, I think, to frame it. I guess Dean and I probably are biased since we both are communists, but that's okay. I think we can still take what you're saying and do something good with it. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show and talking to us about the issue of Assyrians and also talking about your book. It was really cool to hear, I think, all of this from you, and really helpful to get like a broader understanding of what's been going on. And so that we can just, have some kind of aid to think through these geographies and histories and groups of people that we have very little access to otherwise. So really, thanks a lot for coming and talking to us.
Well, thank you guys. Thanks, Matt and Dean. I really appreciate it. It was fun, although I feel like I just, of course, discussed. I don't know if you can say discussed when it's predominantly one side, where you just continue talking for quite some time. But I hope it made sense. I hope there wasn't anything that was too crazy or offensive to anyone. But I just wanted to make things as understandable, as clear as possible in regard to the Assyrians, just because there are so many misnomers and misconceptions about the Assyrians, about the Middle East in general, West Asia. Again, here's to discuss terminologies and nomenclature. I would say you guys, my guess would be that you probably feel something very similar if you are going to be self-identified communists, and how somebody would identify a communist is also problematic, because these terms mean so many different things to different people, and it's very hard for us to explain it in each one of these contexts, so that people understand us in a way that's, again, I have to go back to the idea of authentic, in a way that's authentic, that's reflective of who and what we are. So in this case of the Assyrians, again, this was at least my work was a narrative. It was a narrative of the Assyrians, and that's what I wanted people to understand. It was a narrative of the Assyrians, and there are so many narratives of the Assyrians. There are as many narratives as there are people. And it's I'll extend that again, since for someone who does work on animal studies, to say that recently we've started to think about the history of Europe from the perspective of horses. Think of the certain conquests, certain wars with or without horses, and the large role that horses have played in the history of humanity, but in the history of the world in general. So these are things that we tend to bypass, we tend to make assumptions of, but usually there are lots of things that play roles in our context, and in any context, that for whatever reason we either regulate to fourth world identity issues or to something we just don't seem to want to discuss. And so it's my hope that at least this understanding of panenhistoricism, from the sense of panentheism, that it's okay if we don't have the whole story. That there is a big S story, there is a big R reality in that sort of objective sense, but it's okay, because we'll probably never understand that, and that's the point. We will not fully understand it, but we can offer as many stories, and every one of these stories are that sort of reflection. To go back to my book, they're a reflection. They're a shadow of the big R reality, the big H history. They're just a reflection of it. And that in and of itself makes every one of those stories so damn important and essential to who and what we are.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm really coming to, I think, like and appreciate the panenhistorical term. I think that's a really fun idea. I like that a lot.
I didn't want the religious studies folks to, and I'm a religious studies scholar too, so I didn't want them to get too hurt about that particular issue. I do love I do love panentheism as well, which is why I couldn't think of a better term. I wanted to utilize some sort of an Eastern term for it, come up with some word in Assyrian, and then I thought, this is probably easier if I just do this.
Yeah, it's cool.
Well, I appreciate it. If anyone can think of something that's a little more musical, that would be great.
Yeah, well, good luck anyway with continuing with that research, and also good luck with the fantasy novels. We'll look forward to checking those out.
Oh, I appreciate it. That's where my heart lies right now. Between that and animal studies. So I do appreciate that, guys. It's been a lot of fun, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, us too.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Dean.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard in this episode, you can support us on patreon.com/themagnificast. Also, don't forget, you should be supporting Maya as well, because they've got a lot of cool stuff going on. So patreon.com/ninwa. Neat. If you like the show, you can follow us on Twitter. Tweet about us. Tell everyone how much you like us and whatever. You can also buy t-shirts and stickers and things from us if you want on Redbubble. Cool. Thanks to Amaria Armstrong for the very good intro music, and thanks to The Illogical Spoon for the very good outro music. It's all just good music here on this podcast at both ends of it. Cool. See you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.